Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, Ravi Yelamanchili. Did I get that right? That's a long name. Ravi is a poet, but also, he works in high tech as a business analyst, and he at Vision 33. And his writing is previously published in the Muddy River Review, our mutual friend Zvi Sessling, and the Somerville Times, my column, and Sahita Akademi, Indian Literature. I get that right?
Close enough.
Okay. Muse, India, and several other journals. He also works with Daniel Georges and Mary Bouchinger Bardwell and who else?
Hilary Salick.
In a special workshop there at Lesley, recently read at Lesley. He also won the Boston Mayor's Poetry Program contest and the University of Pittsburgh undergraduate poetry contest. You went to school at the University of Pittsburgh, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh no, was it the university or you went to Penn State? The University of Pittsburgh. Okay, yeah. Okay, so Ravi, you're a high-tech business analyst, but you are certainly not one-dimensional. I mean, how did you start in poetry? What steeped you in this?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because it was funny because I remember when I was in high school and the freshman year of high school, I decided that I had folders for every subject, and I decided that for English I was going to use the red folder because I thought I was going to get a lot of red marks on my papers because English was always like a second language for me, and it was.
So you were born in India?
I was born here. I was raised in India for a couple of years. Then I came here, but I was a first generation kid, so English was very difficult for me, and the grammar, the rules, it was all tough. But 10th grade is when I started writing, and I wrote 2 poems just for the fun of it. And then I was at Barnes & Noble's one day studying, and I met a writer there, Donald Calvanese. He published a book, and he was selling books there, and I went and I talked to him. And he said, do you write? And I said, I wrote these 2 poems. And he said, send them to me. So I did. And he published them on his website. And then he mentored me a little bit early on. And then from there, I just kept writing and sending out. And I got a lot of rejections at like the first 2 years. But then I started publishing after that. And then I published in, as you mentioned, Somerville Times, Muddy River, Sahitya Academy's Indian Literature, and then upcoming in Ibbotson.
So, your poem, which you showed me, Atima tu Ratka Tasha, is a sort of persona poem, and you inhabit an old woman, an old woman, a literate beggar, and as a persona poem, you sort of really do inhabit this woman. How hard was that, being a young man and a male? And tell me about that process.
So I was trying to understand what voice was as a writer, as a poet, what it meant. And I went to a reading at my school. The poet was Roger Reeves.
Okay.
And after the reading was done, I went up to him and I asked, what does voice mean? What does it mean for me as a writer to write in voice? How do I find my voice? And he looked at me and he just said, voice is whatever inhabits the piece, the narrative that inhabits the piece. And he said, why don't you try writing in a voice that isn't similar to your own? So I said, I'm going to write in the voice of an elderly woman because that's the opposite of what I am. And I started writing in it, and then that exercise kind of evolved, and I started reading other works in that general, written in similar voices. So
what works, for instance?
There was a lot of I read some journals about elderly people. I read.
This was an elderly Indian woman, right?
It takes place in India. The premise of the entire piece is that. So in Hindu mythology, one of the incarnations of Vishnu is Krishna, and Krishna, he, unlike some of Vishnu's other avatars, he understands like who he is from the beginning. So he knows he's a god essentially, and he's raised in a village, and he's raised by all these villagers, and when he leaves his village, he never comes back. And so his childhood lover Radha, I wrote in her voice, except she's on her deathbed when this is happening, so she's old, her whole life has passed, and she's never seen him again, and she has dementia, and she's kind of thinking back to her childhood, trying to make sense of everything, because from what I understand, at least, with dementia and Alzheimer's, the things that are most distant to us start falling off in terms of from a memory perspective. So she's trying to piece together her past and her identity, and a part of this is kind of piecing the mythology in, and I'm expanding this into a longer book-length project, and what I'm trying to do with that book is kind of take more and more, like, I want to play with the idea of tragedies and comedies. So in the poem, the 3-page poem that I wrote, it's very clear that she is in fact Radha, but I want this to come off in such a way that, to be written in such a way that the reader will never know whether she is Radha or she isn't Radha. All they're going to know is that she's an old woman on her deathbed, and how they interpret it is going to determine whether or not the book is going to be a tragedy or a comedy. And I speak of tragedies and comedies in the very traditional...
They're closely aligned, right?
Yeah, like the Aristotelian kind of sense.
So did you actually read this to an elderly woman to get some feedback?
I did. I had some family friends. I had.
I don't mean like 40 years old. I mean like.
No. Yeah. Like 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
And I had some older professors read it. So I wanted to really make a voice check to make sure I was writing it the right way, and.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time with it, just kind of hammering.
Well, I've noticed that you're very meticulous about some people, rush things, but you go over and over. Even to come on this show, it took you a year and a half for you to prepare to come on. Remember, you didn't want to do it initially, yeah. And so you're not. I imagine you're meticulous in everything you do. It seems that, let's talk. We're in Somerville now, and this poem that actually is in the new issue of Ibbotson Street, you're on our front page, along with such DeWitt Henry, the founder of Plowshares Magazine, Ted Kooser, who's the poet laureate, Ravi. You there?
We try to promote you,
because we think, as I put in the introduction, that you think you have great promise, and that you have a great career ahead of you as a poet, and I'm sure in other things too. But you in the poem, I believe it's the what's the name of that on the promenade? Walking backward on the promenade. You're very concerned about containment, and in Somerville, you encounter a tree that's breaking through a gate. And it successfully breaks through, but it's scarred, but it's free. But talk us about this recurrent theme in your work.
Yeah, so the project kind of started with me trying to understand the concept of free will, predestiny. That's a pretty frequently discussed philosophical question, mm-hmm. But it mainly came up when I was reading an excerpt from Kierkegaard. It was late at night, so I don't even remember what the excerpt was or what book it was from. But Kierkegaard talks about how he, rather than dealing with absolutes in the free will or predestiny, he talks about this idea of free will within parameters, free will that's contained in a sense. And I started thinking about this idea of contained free will. And so that's kind of what this poem is looking into, is this idea of individuals, animals, organisms having the ability to be free, but either being contained, containing themselves by choice, and the process of breaking through. So one of the words that I use in the poem is this word called estivation, and it's there's the African lungfish. It'll, during periods of extreme drought, it'll actually just kind of go into it's a reverse hibernation-like state, in the sense that hibernation happens in cold weather, but estivation usually takes place in extreme heat, and the animal just kind of shuts down its metabolism, and it just kind of lives off its stored body fat or muscle. So the lungfish, and the reason why I like the word estivation is because it can mean that, this kind of hibernation-like state, or it can also mean the arrangement of flower petals before they blossom. So the word itself has such a unique dichotomy to it, and I think that word itself expresses this idea of being contained and then breaking free.
And how can you relate that to your own life? I mean, I'm sure that's an issue that we all face, containment and breaking free. I don't want to get too personal, but
no.
It's always, yeah.
So this kind of goes back to like how I constantly bring Diogenes into this. So Diogenes, his story is that he started off in his Diogenes of Sinope, as opposed to the other Diogenes out there.
This is Diogenes the cynic, right?
Right. So cynic means dog-like in Greek. So, but he came from a place called Sinope. I think there's a city in modern-day Turkey called Sinope, and there his father did something with currency. I think that's all that historical records show. And he started defacing the currency. And there's belief that there was either he did it with political motives, or there was a prophecy. And the prophecy told Diogenes that his life's work was to deface the currency. And
was to what?
Deface the currency. So he started defacing the currency.
It's a metaphor for
social currency, which is what he starts defacing once he goes to Athens.
Okay.
But so he starts defacing the currency, gets kicked out, then he goes to Athens, and in Athens he's like the crazy uncle kind of figure. He lives in a wine barrel, he does what he wants, eats where he wants, and he does all these crazy antics, but these antics are kind of to demonstrate to people that the social currency is the social norm, so things that we come to accept without really thinking too much about them. And I guess kind of going back to my life, I'm sure there's a lot of things that I just do because you're supposed to do it without really thinking.
I think that's the human condition. We have tradition, and we want to breaking through from tradition, and then coming back to tradition. Yeah. Yeah,
and then accepting things at face value simply because we have to accept them, or we've heard it so many times we don't question certain things. And I think what Diogenes demonstrated in his own life was he never wrote a single book of philosophy, or at least that we have still. And but through his actions, he demonstrated like a very profound philosophy.
So he wasn't any armchair philosopher. He went,
he was a wine barrel.
Wine barrel. I think the noted critic Neil Katz pointed that out at a recent meeting.
Yeah.
Death has always been a subject of mine. I'm sure of everyone. I think everything is, to some extent, run by the knowledge that you're going to die, right? As we often repeat in our meetings. You explore death and in your work, and you fear is, the fear of death I can see as a confinement, because that confines you, I guess, in some ways. But it frees you also, doesn't it?
Well, I think it depends on how we define death itself. Personally, I think of freedom meaning that you need to have the ability to perform action. You need to have agency, and I don't know if I personally don't know what happens after I die or will die, so I don't know if I will have
bring a change
agency.
Of underwear in case.
Yeah,
as the saying goes. Yeah.
So I don't know if I'll have agency or if I won't have agency once I die in that sense. So I think death can frees us from the condition we live in now. It can be an act of reclamation in certain individuals who've been deprived of agency, either bodily or mentally or through their circumstances, revolting against life itself, and using and committing suicide can be in some ways a form of reclaiming agency. But death itself, I don't know if I would consider that as being a form of escape.
Okay.
Or
okay.
If you have freedom after you die.
Yeah, I guess. Often I see in your poems the, again, I think we touched on this, the conflict between the ancient and the contemporary, and it seems that the contemporary decidedly pales. I mean, I was talking about this, reading about these pretentious people with the different various trendy foods they were dealing with, and I don't know. That was just my take, my cursory take, but maybe you can just comment a bit about that. You often bring in these contemporary, trite sort of things that you look at in comparison to maybe something more profound, from ancient tradition.
Yeah.
Am I right, or am I off
No,
base?
you're right, and it's something that I don't know if it's a good thing.
I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's interesting.
It's something I do.
Yeah.
But the way I see it is it's kind of, it's a framing mechanism in the sense that from a literary perspective, literary analysis perspective, when we talk about the ancient, we're still talking about it from a contemporary standpoint. There's no way no matter how many history books you read, that you'd understand the entire context of things that have happened in literary or in historical accounts. So even when we are looking at certain historical events or the ancient, we're still referencing it from today's point of view. And historical accounts of events or ancient texts, they've been modified, they've been changed a lot over time. So I feel that it's not, so when we're looking at it from a contemporary perspective, there's analysis we're already doing, there's changes we're already making, and it's like reading any kind of book and then framing it, like doing analysis on it. Or
what's interesting about you, most people who come to the Bega Bars are all a bunch of people from late 50s to 70s. We have had young people in very the transient, and then they go on and do other things. But you stuck with us, and I mean, a lot of people would be intimidated, but you seem to be an old soul of sorts. I mean that in a good way.
I enjoy listening to you all talk. You've had so much experience, you have so much wisdom. You're all accomplished writers in your own rights. So kind of talking to you and hearing what you have to say, it gives me a whole nother angle on my own writing rather than, and a lot of people my age, if I meet with them, I feel like we're all making similar mistakes because we're all in a similar stage of life.
You could see true failure and
no. But recognizing that is also kind of, I think, it comes with a certain kind of wisdom.
Well, you've got, you've got about less than 10 minutes, but you can read some of your fine work.
We'll start with the piece that's coming out in Ibbotson, Walking Backwards.
Yes, in late June. Okay. Do you have it with you?
Yeah. And if we have time, I can move to the other pieces.
Yeah, we got about, we got 9 minutes now.
Walking backwards along the path of the promenade. But truly, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes, Alexander the Great. Part 1. Some cocoons are spun from silk, others formed from clay and mucus. The West African lungfish estivates, waiting for rain for up to 3.5 years. Dust gathered on her cello's black thermoplastic case. She tells me her boyfriend doesn't like classical music. At dusk, while she hums Bach, I lean against the countertop, sculpting an orange into a globe, turning its skin into continents. She steeps lavender, saffron, and mulberry in boiling water, claims it calms her anxiety, and asks me to pour silk almond milk for her vegan kitten. I tell her I will after I finish carving out the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. government gave Gillette shave kits to its soldiers during World War I. A close shave guarantees a tight-fitting gas mask. During World War II, Churchill wore a custom-made oxygen mask that let him smoke cigars on airplanes. A bulldog's pushed-in nose can cause it to inhale when it sneezes, or reverse sneeze, which makes it look like it's choking. The African lungfish must surface for air every 30 minutes, or drowns like the rest of us. This is why biologists show interest, a potential evolutionary link. The word cynic is derived from ancient Greek meaning dog-like. Alexander the Great stood before Diogenes the Cynic and asked him what he wanted. Diogenes asked him to move aside and stop blocking his sunlight. Many flower buds need sunlight to open. In a park in Somerville, someone put up a chain-link fence where an oak tree was growing. The tree eventually broke through, but its bark remained checkered. If it were grilled meat, we would have seen it on the cooking channel. Claude Monet's cataracts made everything look muddy, and he painted the world through the eyes of a terracotta soldier buried in another's grave. After his cornea was removed, he saw ultraviolet color, the way birds see. When birds breathe, air flows in only one direction. Microsoft filed a patent on a microphone that will let you speak while inhaling. Words will become gasps. I laughed when I saw the bags of frozen chicken in a supermarket. Some people asked me what was so funny, and I replied saying, "What tragedy has befallen Plato's man?" As I walked away, I heard someone whisper, "There's all sorts of crazy at this time of night." Plato defined man as a featherless biped and was applauded for his clever definition. Diogenes plucked the feathers from a cock, let it run loose on Plato and his crowd, and proclaimed, "Behold Plato's man." Diogenes is said to have died at about 90. The historical accounts of possible causes of Diogenes' death, eating a raw ox's foot or a raw octopus, rabies from a dog bite, and or suicide from holding his breath. I tell an old lady sitting next to me on the commuter rail that I have asthma. She tells me that her son had schizophrenia, one of Haldol's side effects is shortness of breath, and that he accidentally stabbed himself to death with a steak knife because he thought someone was choking him. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, survived multiple assassination attempts and became so obsessed with death he swallowed mercury pills believing it would grant him immortality. It was prophesied that the Greek playwright Aeschylus would die from something falling on him, so he stayed outside a lot. An eagle mistook his bald head for a rock, dropped a turtle on it, and killed him. Han Dynasty Taoist monks tried to find the elixir of life, but accidentally invented gunpowder instead. And goldfish can grow to about a foot long and live for decades, but die in a couple of years because people put them in tiny bowls. Their organs keep growing, while their bodies are forced to remain the same size. When I was 7, whenever we drove in the rain, I used to pretend that the raindrops running on the car window were migrating wildebeest. I told myself that the ones that did not follow the others must be running from something. You say you do not have a goldfish, but I assure you you do. We all have goldfish that we have left in bowls.
Nice. So we do have about less than 5 minutes. Want to read another short one? Or you have a short one, or?
I have Atmatu Radhikatasya, but I could probably do that in
about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Atmatu Radhikatasya. Radha, you are his soul. Part 1. Savikalpa Samadhi. Of you these days, I hear only in murmurs, and my eyes see everything in twos, like the moons my drunken husband sang his life away to. Then, when we were still young, too foolish to realize the heavens to be nothing more than the space between the arch of your foot and the earth, the impressions of your thieving footfall, we hung our earthen pots of butter as high as we could in our lowly mud brick homes. We complained to Yashoda and shooed you away as if you were a nuisance. The old crow flies with ease today. Its cause make no mention of when Dhumavati and the 9 others will come, or of when the 108 smoke-faced sons of daylight and shadow will leave, but instead only bring back gossip of you. Squinting, I try to trace the motions of its beak with my fingers, but these 5 rickety, time-worn gates refuse to budge. Part 2. Asampragnita Samadhi. Lately the cows have been giving only water, and Yema has grown so fat, he looks 8 months pregnant. Back then you stole my sari while I bathed in the Yamuna, when it was more beautiful than the hide of Maricha, disguised as a golden deer. But now, after many years of wearing, has become discolored and wrinkled. The strings and muscle fibers barely holding together, I lay on my last bed, breathing death, brushing my hands through piles of shards and dust. Of the pots you broke and left behind, I try to rebuild memories of you out of bone and ash, but Indra hurls his boulders and crushes my every attempt. I give up exhausted of forgetfulness, I weep and call out to you, but this time you don't raise any mountains. Indra mocks me and asks me why I think you'd want to meet an ugly old illiterate beggar like me, and laughs when I tell him that we are lovers, that I am Lakshmi, that I am, Aye Asar Aye, that you are, Tattvam Asi. Sudama gave you flattened rice, but Krishna, I will give you your soul. Part 3. Nirvikalpa Samadhi. From the isolated corridors and chambers of my mind, you come adorned in a robe of golden smoke, but this time your hair isn't dressed with its usual peacock feathers. I rejoice after seeing you again, and become young once more. As I reach out to embrace you again and dance with you once more, you slip from my arms again, but instead this time you press your red lips against my forehead and play my chakras as a cowherd plays a 7-holed flute. Through the inhalation of breath you plant the seed from which Brahma, the prime mover, was born. Through its sustaining you water and weed Vishnu, the source field, and through its exhalation you lift me up onto your shoulders and bring Shiva, the fruit of your labor, the destroyer of time, and all that was born within its bounds, within my arm's reach. Breaking silence with silence, you play the Saptarishis, your 7 swaras, in an infinite series of combinations, and give rise to the 4 Vedas, milking the Vedas into the Upanishads. You turn the Upanishads into the Mahavakyas, molding life out of clay. You fill empty pots, smash them, and drain their contents into your mouth. As the space within and outside the pots merge together, I finally understand what you meant to show me all along. I realize Brahman and Atman and you and I as always having been, as always becoming, and as always being one.
Nice. We've got a few seconds left. Are you appearing anywhere, to read or anymore?
Maybe sometime in the near future, but I'm not sure as of right now.
Okay. And I imagine it's great to be working with the former Boston Poet Laureate, Daniel Georges, and the head of the New England Poetry Club, Mary Bushinger, and Hilary Selleck. I imagine you got a lot from that. Well, thank you very much.